Testing. Testing. Here we go. All righty. Good morning to all. Welcome to this first ISTEC Distinguished Lecture for the semester. Today we have a very distinguished lecture with a very interesting topic. But before that, let me say a couple of words as people are trickling in on ISTEC. So my name is Edwin Chong. I'm the director of ISTEC. ISTEC stands for the Information Science and Technology Center, which is a university-wide organization at CSU covering all aspects of information sciences and technologies, including research, education, and outreach. And one of the activities we have every semester is the Distinguished Lecture Series, of which this is one. To introduce today's distinguished lecturer, let me get to the podium Jonathan Carlyon, who is a professor of Spanish in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures.
Well, thank you for everyone for coming out this morning. Before I introduce our guest speaker, actually, I wanted to ask, how many of you are from the College of Liberal Arts? Wonderful. How many of you are from the College of Natural Sciences? Okay. Other colleges? What college are you from? Engineering, College of Engineering. Terrific. Well, thank you again and welcome. I'm happy to introduce this diverse group of scholars and students who are able to be here this morning to attend the first ISTEC lecture for spring 2019. Our speaker today is Dr. David Barry. David is a professor of digital humanities at the University of Sussex. In 2018, he was on the Faculty of History at the University of Oxford, as well as a visiting fellow that same year at Cambridge University. His research covers a seemingly broad range of topics, including critical digital humanities, philosophy of the university, critical university studies, philosophy of technology, algorithms, and software. He has published equally broadly on the subjects of the philosophy of computation, the reassembling of the university, numerous books on the digital humanities. My graduate students are currently reading his 2017 Introduction to Digital Humanities. He has also published on aesthetics, art, design, the philosophy of software, and the politics of copyright. Again, these topics may seem broad, but perhaps this range is not so broad after all. For whatever else it may be, the digital humanities is profoundly and by necessity a deeply interdisciplinary activity. The colleges represented here this morning all have a stake in these studies. For as Dr. Barry teaches, this digital age in which we are living, this specific moment in history, represents a profound transformation of our intellectual and scientific work. As David emphasizes, it marks a new Cambrian explosion, where the multiplication of life in the virtual world across numerous spectrums is forcing us all to adjust, to improvise, and to grow. The effects of these changes are having on the university are profound, and Dr. Barry is at the forefront of scholars seeking to provide us with some orientation to the transformation of the idea of a university. Please welcome Dr. David Barry.
Hello. Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to Jonathan. Thank you to ISTEC. It's really quite wonderful to be in Colorado. I've never been here before, so it's really, really lovely to see the state. And I saw the Rockies yesterday, which was also fantastic. I am still acclimatizing to your very, very dry climate. So I will be having water quite a lot through the talk, I think. It's very, very dry here, as I'm sure you're aware. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is that the way in which I'm presenting is a kind of experimental method. I'm working with the iPad and the use of a kind of stylus to sort of create a kind of interactive method of presentation. It's still very experimental. The software actually is also very immature in many ways, but quite interesting. This method that I'm using, I'm calling the post-digital lecture, so it's got a term, and it really involves using these kinds of techniques that you'll see as I go through. I will be highlighting things, perhaps to draw attention to them, maybe writing some bits and pieces or circling things. So really the idea is that this kind of interactivity, I think, represents something interesting and new, but also kind of old in a way for the presentation of information. And I suppose what I'm gesturing to is, maybe, hopefully, it's the depth of the slide as a unidirectional way of communicating. So I think there's something very interesting about this. So you'll see this as I talk. So you'll notice the title of my talk is different to the one that's on the sheet. It's essentially the same lecture, but I thought this kind of captured it a little bit better. The idea of the talk really is to think through the way in which we think of the university, the way in which historically we have theorized the university, the way in which historically we've theorized the idea of a university. And what I'm trying to do is connect that up to the possibility that we need to rethink or revisit the idea of a university, the concept of an idea of a university. So there will be a kind of in-depth discussion of many of these issues. Before I talk, I also want to just say that this research was made possible by a funding body in Britain called the British Academy, without which I wouldn't have had the research time actually to spend a lot of time thinking about these issues. So I'm very grateful to the British Academy for the funding that made this research possible. Okay, so here we go. So the first thing we should observe is that the university is changing. I think there's no surprise there. But the university, I think, is changing in really interesting and profound ways. The way in which the university was originally understood was as a kind of cloistered space, separate from society, a different temporal and spatial structure associated with it. The idea that, as it were, thinking, the ability to perform thought, required a distance from everyday life, from the everyday life structures, from even the economy, as it were. It was a different political economy that gave it a sense of space that was separate. And this has been a very important part of our history and traditions in the university. And there is a kind of cultural lag, as it were. These concepts remain still, I think, very important in our appreciation of what a university is and what a university does. We unconsciously sometimes actually perform this historical notion, this historical conceptual construction. But it's clearly also true that the university isn't what it once was, right? The university has shifted. The last 150 years or so have been a profound transformation in our idea of a university, such that, for example, as Bill Redding said, that the university lies in ruins. The university is in ruins. And what does this mean for the university to be in ruins? It's the idea that the university doesn't know what a university is anymore, right? It's kind of interesting. Part of this archival work has been actually visiting the archives of a number of universities, and one of my guilty pleasures that I'm somewhat embarrassed to reveal to you is that I actually quite enjoy reading president speeches of universities, particularly historical speeches. And it's very notable that in the last massive paradigm shift, I think, that occurred in the university and theorizations around the university in the late 1890s towards around about the 1930s, there is a profound interest in what a university is. The idea, the question of a university becomes very, very profound, and actually you get quite profound insights from, and I know this is quite surprising, from presidents of universities. They're clearly thinking about these issues, reading around these issues, and communicating these issues. In the more contemporary milieu, this is notably absent, right? There is an absence in the way in which the university is communicated, particularly from the leadership. And that absence, it is often argued, has been filled by the concepts that are derived from the economy, from the market, and so we have a marketized conceptualization, a very heavily accountancy-driven language, right? Credits, accountancy, and essentially this conceptualization of university is a big set of spreadsheets where numbers move around. And what I think is interesting is that to me is the university in ruins. That does for me, really perform that ruin of the university. So What does that mean for the modern concept of the university then? Well, the university, the end of the university has been called many times. The question of what a university is, does it matter, has also been commented on. For example, in the 1920s, Robert Maynard Hutchins famously remarked that the modern university is a set of schools and departments held together by a central heating system. Right? So the only commonality he could identify in the 1920s was the boiler. Later in the 1960s, Clark Kerr famously updated this notion to be a series of individual faculty entrepreneurs held together by a common grievance over car parking. And I'm sure maybe you'll recognize that. I certainly recognize that from my university, actually. Car parking is always a contentious issue. And today, we might suggest, or certainly I would suggest, we have a similar kind of grievance, a similar kind of suspicion is manifest towards computation or the computational, right? Computation feels like a kind of problem. Certainly we find our VLE systems extremely difficult to use, and students often complain about them. But also the very idea that computation is in some sense penetrating the university is somehow from outside the university and somehow undermines the very ideas, even if we can't necessarily articulate them, of a university. And what I want to do is kind of problematize that notion. I don't think it's necessarily helpful to think of computation as being outside the university and coming in, and rather actually suggest that the university itself can reconceptualize computation to be a part of its kind of history and shared ideas. So it's certainly the case, I think, that, and it's certainly now, I think, the case that we can accept, that we live under conditions of computation, right? Computation now is very much part of everyday life for all of us. It's extremely difficult to avoid computation now in everyday life. I think you would, you'd have to go and live in a hut in the Rockies or something really to try to get away from it. I did note, actually, as we got higher and higher in the Rockies, I drove up there with Jonathan yesterday, that 4G fell away, then 3G fell away, then even Edge fell away. So you knew you were really in the middle of nowhere, as it were. But actually, it's very, very difficult to get away from these kind of computational systems, away from the very elements of computation that we increasingly rely upon. And I think one way of thinking about this really is that, well, if it is indeed true, and it certainly, the empirical evidence seems to suggest that the economy is increasingly being digitized, it is a digital economy that we have today, or certainly we could argue that the computation is a condition of possibility for our modern economies, then, well, what does that mean for the university? What does it mean for the university to have a condition of possibility, in some sense guaranteed or structured in and through computation? This clearly links to a lot of interesting ideas around infrastructure, research infrastructures, the large number of companies that lie outside the university boundaries and very keen to sell us solutions for computational problems, but I'll just gesture to those rather than going to them immediately. So, how can we think about this? How can we theorize this? Well, one way that I think is quite interesting is Gibbon's work on the idea of a distinction between mode 1 and mode 2 knowledge. This is the idea that when the university shifted over the course of the 20th century, it shifted increasingly away from disciplinary knowledge. And here I mean disciplinary in terms of the disciplines, the standard departmental, I suppose, orientation of the university, towards mode 2 knowledge, which they thought of as interdisciplinary knowledge. So here, where one would have worked with colleagues within one's discipline, where one would have relied on the structures of the discipline, including the national and international structures around disciplinary knowledge formations. For Gibbons, mode 2 knowledge meant that, well, actually, increasingly, the kinds of questions that were coming up in research, the kinds of problematics that were coming up in research, would increasingly be interdisciplinary. So a very contemporary way of thinking about this is the notion of global challenges or challenges. And actually this increasingly is talked about in terms of missions, which I find a very interesting language if you haven't come across it already, but it draws from NASA, actually, the idea of the moon mission or so on and so forth. This language of mission is very, very fascinating, I think. So what I want to do is suggest that perhaps, just in an analytical sense, computation is something different. It's not just about interdisciplinarity. It's not just about bringing research teams together that bring multiple differing methodologies and ways of seeing to a project, to a team, as it were. But actually, mode-free knowledge, if there is such a thing, is something to do with this notion of data, computation, the digital per se. So I'll come back to this notion. The idea of the data intensivity, the centrality of data and computation to the way in which knowledge is understood. So what I want to do is really, as I talk through this series of slides, is really to raise the question of, well, what might be the idea of a university under these conditions of computation, right? What has changed? So what I'm going to do really is provide a map, a form of a genealogy, and really try to analytically draw out ways in which we can think about these, I suppose, in a certain sense, epistemes, or perhaps epochs of the university. And of course, this is a broad brush a method, a way of talking about university. I don't want you to understand this as in some sense deterministic. There are obviously at varying moments different discourses around the university. There are in conflict, etc. But certainly the idea of university, I think, is useful, and part of the reason I excavate this notion is because I think it helps us to understand the kind of trajectory of the university, and also perhaps reflect on what the university was and what the university might be. So let me just that. That's going to be the key notion that should come up again and again as we talk about these things. Now, of course, the university is very notable for being something that people in the university think a lot about, right? Not necessarily something that people outside of the university have a lot of interest in. There are moments of crisis, as it were, usually linked to funding or to a political contestation where the university does become a big political issue, big political question. But generally speaking, within the university, there is notable historical timeline, as it were, where the university becomes rather settled. There becomes a kind of stability around the conceptual apparatus we use when we think about the university. We just get on with it because we're quite happy with the way in which we think about these things. Again, perhaps we can think about the way Kuhn talks about this. The notion of the distinction between normal science and revolutionary science might be a helpful way for us to conceptualize this, to think about this. And what I'm suggesting is, choose a better colour, is that perhaps, aptly read, but what I'm suggesting is that in some sense, computation is driving us into a revolutionary moment, right? It does question many of our taken for granted in the university. Many of our means of communication, for example, are transformed with the university. I mean, email is one thing, but I know my university struggles with understanding, what's the point of WhatsApp, what's the point of Instagram, what's the point of messaging and the messaging revolution that's going on. Certainly, I note, as well as the university communications, that my students don't check their email. For them, that's some kind of old-fashioned technique that only people over the age of 40 use, and certainly not very helpful. And so, actually, some things happen with the digital, but we don't want to get into a situation where we're essentially chasing the students, right? We want to try and get ahead of this and understand these transformations, and actually be able to contribute to that transformation, and certainly in terms of thinking about the frameworks for the university and the structures of the university. So, in this talk anyway, I am going to draw upon this historical and empirical material. I am going to try to place it in this, this historical movement of ideas. And I am going to gesture towards some of the ideas that I'm kind of working through in order to think about data intensivity and how data intensivity might change the concept, or certainly reassemble the concepts around the university per se. One of the reasons that drives this research, as I said previously, is because, well, firstly, there is a sense that the idea of a university is old-fashioned, right? And that kind of positioning, which in some sense dates to Clark Kerr, actually, who argued that the university was dead, right? We don't have universities, we have multiversities, and multiversities, by their multiplicity, can no longer have a central idea. There's no centrality for us to communicate across disciplinary moments. Now, of course, Clark Kerr was talking in the 60s. Here we are in the 2010s, and the digital is quite interesting in offering a new centrality, a new core idea, as it were. So I think that's very suggestive. The other thing is the return of a philosophy of utility. The philosophy of utility is certainly something that I don't think has ever gone away, although it has been contested over the history of the university. Notably, very important in the early part of the 20th century for thinking of the university, and became broadly hegemonic in a certain sense. But one of the things I do note in the ways in which universities get talked about today is the justifications do tend to, unfortunately, turn to utility as being the core way of thinking about the kinds of activities we do, which could be, for example, student employment, right? It could be the university essentially being the R&D department for corporations, right? You can see how this philosophy of utility, the usefulness of the university, can quite easily become too strong, and therefore, you know, you can imagine quite perverse outcomes from this kind of philosophical orientation to thinking about the university. Perhaps the best example of this was in Japan. I presume the Minister for Education had read a little bit too much of the recent literature around the university, and using this kind of philosophical approach, they'd come to the conclusion that, well, actually humanities have no value because you can't externalize them in this kind of utilitarian way, right? The humanities have no value. And so the Japanese minister, about 3 years ago, announced all humanities departments at all universities in Japan would be closed. They would be no longer funded, right? Now, the government has pulled back from this, but at the time there was a very shocking implication from this kind of utilitarian thinking. And again, the philosophy of utility, the idea of usefulness as the determinant, is also represented in what's often called neoliberal thinking, market-oriented thinking, the nickels and dimes of whether a course can run, how many people you teach, and so on and so forth, the money following the student. Which is not to say that the political economy of the university isn't important. Of course, it's crucially important, but it can't be the only way we think of the universities. And in fact, this has become a huge political issue in Britain. Of course, it's not the most important issue in Britain at the moment. That's obviously Brexit. But perhaps the second most important thing is actually, would you believe it, the university. And the reason is because our students now pay very high tuition fees, which is a very recent change in the university funding structure in Britain. Ironically, they don't. It's a cheat towards taxation, but actually it's never, because everyone was so scared of the word tax, it was re-articulated as tuition fees. I won't go into the detail of it, but essentially students got quite annoyed by it, as you can imagine, these notional numbers attached to the names, and they voted very heavily against the sitting government, which terrified Theresa May, right? So this is now a big problem in Britain, and there's a big review that's about to publish. If you're interested, actually, it's the Auger Review, if you want to look out for it. Should be coming out in the next few months, depending on whether Britain becomes a kind of burnt-out anarchist land after leaving the EU. Anyway, so really this notion of philosophy of utility is part of my part of the subject that I'm speaking to. Oh, and I just would like to also note, I do think this is quite a nice idea, the idea of the university as a compass. One of the things that, certainly comes apparent if you talk to presidents and universities is they often don't have a compass. They seem to be really winging it when the direction of the university comes to the fore, often because of this absence, I would argue, but also because utility and economism becomes a driver. So the idea of this talk and the idea of this research that I'm doing really is, what would it mean to reclaim the university from its purported ruins? And what then are the fundamental conditions of a kind of social epistemology for the university? What are the implications of the digital in terms of the research activity, in terms of the knowledge production, in terms of the preservation function of the university writ large? And of course, that's also speaking to society as well, right? What is it universities are for, and what is it that universities should mean to us? And it's very hard to do this, as you can imagine, without falling into nostalgia. Things were better 20 years ago. I mean, that's the classic white-haired professor's comment, right? Always glad to retire because things have gotten so bad. We do have to be very careful about this trap of nostalgia. So we have to be critical about these concepts, as well as thinking about how previous ways of thinking are very important. Now, one of the things, or one of the concepts I've started to think about is really how can we conceptualize the way in which we talk about the university writ large, whether as an institution or as an idea. And I have been using this notion of universality, so the idea that there is a kind of, shall we say, a kind of a weak essentialism around the structures of the university, and that universality we do use, even if we use it only in a kind of vernacular or an everyday sense, to really identify the constellation of thought and practice that essentially is multiplied through different and actually a large number of different kind of institutions, right? What is a university is often a kind of interesting question, right? We rely on a variety of ideas to be able to understand these things. In America, you talk about R1, R2, and R3, or whatever. Universities using those Carnegie classifications, which themselves are, very old classificatory techniques. But the idea really is that how is it that we have this concept of university more generally? So this notion of universality is one of the concepts I'm using to think through this. And this notion of universality, really, it draws from the Latin universitatis. And the idea really is that universitatis remains an important way of thinking through the university, right? So what is the universitatis? Well, the universitatis clearly is a medieval concept, medieval idea. And quite simply, it's that it's a kind of group organization. It's an organizational structure around a group such that the universitatis can own and control property and therefore create a kind of stability or continuity in an organizational sense. And it's really from this notion of universitatis that the notion of university comes forwards. And universitatis is very strongly linked with the notion of community, right? Very much strongly noted. So it's a corporate body, a corporate structure. And as I've said, the universitatis, although it finally came to mean what we think of the university and sometimes the college, certainly in the Oxbridge structure, the universitatis is the college. But the universitatis actually historically was also for a time used to describe, for example, guilds. It was used for a time to describe colleges. It was used for a time to describe even councils, right, local councils. So the universitatis, it's very important because what it allows us to do is to kind of follow this history through. Why have we got such strange names? The Socii means fellows. That's why fellows is a term that's often used in universities. Certainly at Oxford and Cambridge, fellow is a very important notion, but we use it even at universities that are fairly recently founded. We have fellows at Sussex. Sussex was founded in 1961, and we don't have a medieval history, but we nonetheless use these concepts and ideas. So that's a very interesting conditions for particular epistemologies and ways of seeing are historically linked. The universities are a very interesting structure for the way in which they keep and continue to articulate or use certain conceptual structures. Okay. Yeah, and I just want to sort of highlight that the Universitatis is interesting as well because it helps us draw a kind of distinction between a college and university. What I'm really trying to draw your attention to is the modern notions of the distinction between teaching and research is actually drawn out of these conceptual and historical distinctions, right? Teaching was knowledge preservation, that was the work of the college. Research, creation of new knowledge, was the work of the university. This was a strong historical, that's what we've inherited historically. So this notion of the core of a university as a community, I think is hugely important, something that we constantly have to reaffirm and think about, and I'm sure it's something that here at CSU is important to you and something that you articulate or probably gets articulated in the university. The second thing that universality and the corresponding notion of Universitatis allows us to do is to think about the way in which the core, the human core as it were, the socii, the fellows, or the academics as we probably call them, or the scholars, have infrastructures around them, including also a set of students, and this creates the very notion of a university, the very idea of what a university is and the way in which a university functions. Now, these very important organizational elements make the university happen, right? They are embedded, they're embedded structurally, they're embedded in the very concrete and steel that makes up the buildings and the layout of our campuses and universities, and they continually reaffirm, or even you might think of the term prescribe, certain kinds of activity, right? And that's very important, that kind of cultural stability and deliberate social values that's associated with university life. So that's one element that we have to take and take account of when we're thinking about these notions. The other is that the idea of university, whether manifested in concrete or not, is subject to change, right? It is subject to political contestation. It does not stay the same. The way in which the conceptual movement of the idea of university plays out historically is kind of interesting. I haven't really got time to talk about that today. But one of the things I find very interesting about the university is that the differing ideas of a university, none of them ever really dies. They might become rather marginal within our structures, but I think you can still recognize bits of them even today. And you'll probably know colleagues that, in some sense, perform one of the ideas of university. That's very important. So they're always around, and they're maybe marginal, but they're not necessarily dominant. But that shift does happen. There's a conceptual shift over time, and this is the importance of the kind of historical reconfiguration and change in the university. Universities are not locked in aspic, as it were. They do change. And one of the things that's very important to remember about universities, even when we get quite depressed about universities, is that because of the way in which they work by institutional accretion, they are able to take on board new things, right? Of course, for example, science was once thought to be something that shouldn't be taught in a university, right? Oxford certainly was of the opinion that science wasn't worthy as a subject of study, and there have been, multiple English literature was once thought not to be something that should be taught in university. So, and some presidents might agree with that today. But the point is that the university is a master of this institutional accretion. It can take new disciplinary formations in, and the question is how those new disciplinary forms are embedded in the university and how they transform the university. Okay, so what do we mean by the idea of university? Well, if we were to trace back this idea of an idea, as it were, we'd probably start with somebody like Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke articulates this notion, and it's not his notion at all. I mean, you can trace this right back to the genius loci that's thought of in Greek thought. But Edmund Burke nicely articulates it as the spirit of institutions, the idea that institutions themselves have some ephemeral idea or culture or way of being associated with them. Now, Burke, of course, is a conservative, and he was talking particularly about the church. But what's interesting is this idea gets taken up by Coleridge in around 1798, and what he tries to understand is actually social change. And he tries to understand social change and how one can use institutions to both perform change and, in a certain sense, perform evidence for change. So, as I say here, certainly Coleridge was kind of like interested in this notion of the distinction between stasis and revolution. He called it progression and what do you call the other one? I forget it now. Preservation, I think it was. Preservation and progression. And Coleridge thought one of the helpful way to understand change, social change particularly, was through institutions and their essence. And so, although I'm not obviously going to have the time to go into the wonderful depths of the intricacies of Coleridge's thinking, here I'm thinking particularly of the work Church and State, if anyone's interested in looking at it, and the very interesting way he sets up that essentially the university structure, the intellectuals of a society should be state-funded. We really haven't got time to talk about that. What I do think is very powerful is the way in which the idea of a university, the thinking through the idea of a university, plays out in particular ways for the good of a society, for a social good, as it were. And that's very, very important. And the idea is also very important for creating stability, a consistency, as he calls it, or a thread. And again, that's, I think, very interesting in relation to our thinking of the university. Now, what this allows us to do, and certainly this was one of the things that was implicit in the approach, is that once we think about universities in terms of their idea, we can move away from the utilitarian question of what is the use of a university. Because when one thinks in functionist terms about what a university does in terms of use value, as you might think of, we can actually ask rather more interestingly, what is the meaning of a university? Right? I think that's a kind of a more profound way of thinking about these questions. Now, suddenly, this starts a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure you're very familiar with John Henry Newman. The very idea of a university is attributed to Newman, but Newman's leaning heavily on Coleridge and Mill and, of course, Burke. But Newman articulates the idea of a university and the meaning implicit within a university. And this is really, really important because this is where we start to develop this language of thinking about the university in a particular way, right? And this is so important in the 1850s because, of course, this is precisely the moment when industrialism is really becoming quite profound in Britain, of course, but also the challenge from the Oxbridge model of the university, the collegial model of the university, the medieval model of the university is becoming challenged. Actually, as I'm sure you're aware, Oxford and Cambridge had fallen asleep for 300 years. They didn't really do any research, and actually being a fellow mostly involved drinking port and gambling. So this was very important that Newman was thinking about these issues. But also Newman and Mark Patterson and others of the time were visiting Germany, and they were seeing a profoundly new way of thinking about the university. So this is all very important in understanding the constellation of ideas that's going on here. This is not just a British internal conversation, as it were. So this is an articulation of the university. I'm not going to read the quote, but it's on the board there for you to look at. I highlight it in a nice colour. There you go. That's the quote I'm referring to. So once we start to have the conceptual apparatus to think about the university as embodying a certain idea, and that, for example, there can be different ideas of the university and competing ideas of the university, we start to get a way of articulating a comparative analysis, as it were, in relation to social change, the connection of social change to change in knowledges, but also the way in which, for example, industrialism is challenging the university structure in and of itself. What does industrialism mean for the university? Newman doesn't really talk about that, but it's implicit in his approach, right? It lies just on the outskirts of this. So we won't go into a great deal of depth on Coleridge, but what I do want to do is start to draw out these key concepts, right? So, for example, the notion of discipline and piety, right? Those are the ones that Newman certainly is bringing forward. The notion of the cultivation of the factors of mind, mental training, and really, I'm sure you can think of colleagues at the theological, perhaps not so much, but certainly the idea of mental training is quite interesting, both because it's now a marginal practice in the university, but actually with the challenge from digital technology, attentions are problematic today. It's very fascinating that that may well become another important concept. The other really important movement is the foundation of the University College of London, Minerva under gaslights, as it was called, or the steam-powered university. And here we start to see this change really start to happen. The idea of a university is shifting. The influence of the German universities is very important here. And the idea of research is starting to enter the conversation in Britain. This was a very contentious issue. Certainly it was seen as utilitarian because it had no moral responsibility to the students or indeed to the staff. And actually it was a kind of scary idea when it was founded. Just to highlight that the philosophy of utility is very important in the American context at both Cornell and at Harvard. There were key principles for articulating what a university is for. Again, the absence of an idea of university in a certain sense, or certainly a rejection of the collegial model of university, discipline and piety becomes really important. And so we get these articulations, which I'm sure you will recognize. Is a university as a training ground for public service, and that leads to a certain kind of conception of the curriculum, or is it, as Eliot argued, that it's merely something where you can have a lot of choice, a lot of electives, and students should be treated as individuals, and off you go, do what you want. The university merely facilitates that. And again, that's very interesting, this notion of a utilitarianism, returns and returns and returns. As I've mentioned, in Germany, we start to see this notion of research. The idea of university as research becomes very, very important. And actually, this is the kind of key concept that shapes our idea of university over the course of the 20th century. It's fascinating historically that actually over 10,000 Americans studied at German universities, and in fact to get a position in a serious American college or university you would have to have a degree from a German university. Why? Because German universities were doing research. This was a massive change. It was a reflection of industrialism, but also this new notion of the state. Again, I'm not going to go into all the detail of the University of Berlin, but what I do want to draw your attention to is that what was happening here was that professors were becoming more and more interested in the way in which one performed a certain kind of knowledge function. Right? And I want you to sort of make those links to the digital, I suppose. Particularly within teaching, you would start to have this notion of a certain kind of class, a certain kind of reliance on data, what we would call data today, but fieldwork, maps and graphs, visualizations, catalogs and lists of specialized data in class. So research, creation of new knowledge gets linked to the very things that one performs in a university context. And then, of course, the American university takes both the English collegial model and the German research traditions and puts them together in a somewhat, there's a tension that's very interesting within that structure, but nonetheless incredibly powerful. Johns Hopkins, of course, and Chicago, which transforms the university structure in America. The universities, I don't need to say, over the course of the 20th century, it's been the American century in terms of the university, and today, actually, Europe is somewhat late to the game, importing some of the ideas that the American universities have pioneered. So, I'm skipping a little bit because I'm very aware of time. Question then is, well, okay, the American research universities seem to be the end point. It seems to be the place we've got to. Well, great. But the American research university is the research university without the digital. It predates the digital. It really was kind of concretized from the 1930s, say, up until the 1990s, right? It didn't rely on computers, computation, automation that computation made possible, and so on and so forth, right? And it certainly didn't have a sense of the epistemology that the digital makes possible. So the question is, does this idea of research that has been so predominant in the 20th century shift? So under these conditions then of digital technology, is there, and of course I argue there is, a certain kind of epistemic shift happening? And if there is this shift, does this really create a new map of the knowledge structures, right? A new geography, if you want to use a spatial metaphor, under conditions of data intensivity, right? Certainly, we're very aware now that, what was once called post-industrial societies, but we might think more of informational societies, have a heavy reliance on knowledge and knowledge performance, right? On knowledge creation, on computational technologies that make that very knowledge both possible and understandable. And these shifts in knowledge production in, if you like, the way in which knowledge is created, but the methods applied to it, and the way in which knowledge formations emerge from them, what does that mean for the way in which we undertake the kinds of things we do in universities? We have our very traditional structures. We have lectures, we have seminars, perhaps tutorials. We rely on certain dissemination techniques, the monograph, the article, right? These are 20th century notions. And what does this new data-driven situation mean for us? Well, of course, you won't be surprised to know that I do think that the digital implies, not deterministically, because as I said, some practices become marginal, some become dominant. I do think that it's going to be a very interesting transformation that the universities go through, but it has to be a transformation that the universities themselves control. I mean, essentially that's the argument of my book, is that we need to understand these in terms of both the history of the university and what the university can do. So, firstly, the horizon of interpretability is shifting, right? That's very, very important. And it's shifting because of data and algorithms. And we have to understand this and really try to articulate that, whether that's through our existing categories or through a new set of categories, and the way in which we perform university work. The second is, of course, automation. This is a really important question. I saw that MIT published a report on automation this morning. I didn't get a chance to read it before I gave a talk, but automation is very important. The French government published an article on automation last year, proposing that automation would lead to 60% unemployment in France. Well, that's not a sustainable situation, but you can see the way in which the computational change is going to be increasingly important. So this is really, we're living through the emergence of what I call a data-intensive economy. What is a data-intensive economy? Well, it follows the so-called fourth paradigm in science. I'll just choose a different color. If we think paradigmatically about the movement of science, starting with experimental science, then theoretical science, computational science, i.e. model-based thinking about science, and finally, the argument is we're moving to a data-intensive science, heavily reliant on data, heavily reliant on algorithms, heavily reliant on patterns, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. Well, what are the implications of this? Well, some of them are, for example, the 4 V's of data: volume, variety, velocity, and veracity. These new ways of thinking about data and the application of data, a new kind of situation in which scientists and scholars more generally are overwhelmed by this data. How do we make sense of it? How do we put this very fragmented milieu back together in order to generate theories? I mean, of course, some people argue we don't need theory anymore. Famously, Chris Anderson argued that. I disagree. But nonetheless, we need to think through some of these questions. And I do, again, want to keep pushing back to the history of the university. The universities have been through this before. The emergence of the book, the challenge of the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of the campus. These were all really, really quite major changes in the way in which the university thought of itself and the way in which it articulated itself. So what I want to do, I just briefly want to say that, another thing that's very important for us in the university is the university is indeed the home of thought, the city of intellect, as it's sometimes called. Well, it seems that the algorithm, the computational, this data-intensive world, also is a war on thought itself. And that is, of course, a very important, challenging question for us in the university. If we think of thinking as an important part of the job that we do, whether that be in teaching or using, well, the computational challenges many of our traditional notions of what thinking is and how thinking takes place. So I just want to draw a little bit of identity to that. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is going to be very speculative. I really am out of time. I realise that. So I'm skipping a few slides to just give you. It's a shame I can't talk about this, but just haven't got time. I do just want to note that one that I find hilarious. Pittsburgh Cathedral of Learning, metaphors of how you organise a university, but we can't talk about that. One of the things that I am finding quite interesting is the way in which computation is re-articulating itself, rethinking itself, these kind of metaphors of the university. Maybe that's a way into thinking about this new idea of university, or certainly an articulation of it. I quite like this structure that's increasingly important for thinking about the way in which computation happens. So the notion that there's edges, cores, and clouds, and that actually one distributes compute between those different functions. And I think that maybe is quite suggestive to us. What I like about this model is that the current idea is that the edge is very, very important, right? Well, we are, in some sense, at the edge, right? We teach, we meet the students, we do the research, right? The edge is hugely important and somewhat, I think, undervalued under different models of the university. Perhaps this could be a way in which we can start to think about the data intensivity of the university, a way of rethinking the practice of the university, and a way of thinking about the restructuring of the university. So, what are the implications? Well, I think it's more questions than conclusions, but certainly it's been argued that the campus implied the article in the monograph, the campus form of structure. The question is, what does the data intensive imply? Many of you are here from the libraries, etc., and of course you'll probably have to deal with this massive explosion in data and how we think about data and use data and store data, very important. So these are kinds of, I think, very important questions, and very important in the digital humanities as well. What is the output? What is the dissemination that the data intensive implies for us? And so what I'm going to suggest is that we need a new idea of university. Maybe the intent, the idea of data intensivity could be that idea. Maybe data itself would be useful to use to think about these kinds of questions. But whatever it is we do, I think fundamentally we need to connect this new idea of the university to a set of practices and values that are crucial to defending the university, particularly in light of this problematic move to a philosophy of utility. And apologies for going over, but thank you.
Since we're kind of a little over time, maybe we'll just take one quick question. Okay, if not, we have a plaque here to present to Professor Berry. I'm going to read from it real quickly. Presented to David Berry in appreciation for your Information Science and Technology Center, ISTEC Distinguished Lecture, Colorado State University, March 25th, 2019.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.